The council chamber was alive with noise and power. Walls carved from glowing stone and polished metal. Light bending around the ceiling like rivers of gold. Alien delegates filled the curved rows in their elegant robes, armor, and glowing skins. Their voices like 100 storms mixing together. They had gathered from every corner of the galaxy to witness this trial, to see the famous Deathworlder who had defied the Council's law. They came not for justice but for spectacle, because when humans were involved, the galaxy always expected something wild, something that could make them feel superior again. Hundreds of cameras floated silently in the air, red lights blinking as they streamed the event live to millions of systems. Whole worlds were watching this moment, curious to see what Earth would do now that one of its kind was on trial, chained, and surrounded by enemies who thought they had finally broken humanity. At the center of the vast chamber stood a single figure, hands bound in energy cuffs that hummed faintly, head tilted slightly down, hair disheveled, face calm, too calm for someone facing death. His breathing slow and steady, as if he wasn't standing in front of the most feared council in the galaxy, as if he wasn't surrounded by guards with plasma rifles aimed at his chest. His stillness made him look dangerous, like a silent storm waiting to break. Then the chamber doors opened with a loud metallic hiss and the alien commander walked in. His boots hitting the floor like the rhythm of a drum that belonged to war, tall, broad, wrapped in black ceremonial armor marked with gold symbols of victory, the kind worn only by conquerors. His mouth twisted in a confident smile as he raised his chin, letting the whole chamber feel his arrogance. This was his moment, and he wanted the galaxy to see it. He pointed straight at the human like a hunter pointing at prey. His long, clawed fingers steady, eyes narrow and filled with the kind of hate that comes from fear dressed as pride. He walked slowly around the chained human like a predator circling a wounded animal, but the human didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't even look at him at first, just kept his breathing slow like he had all the time in the world, and that silence, that quiet, began to crawl under the alien's skin. The commander's voice echoed through the chamber, amplified by hidden speakers, loud and sharp. He mocked humanity like he had rehearsed these words, calling Earth a dying world, a broken ball of storms and poison that had no place among the stars, calling Deathworlders wild animals, dangerous beasts pretending to be civilized. He spoke like every alien who thought humans were nothing more than a mistake, something the galaxy should have erased long ago. His words made the alien crowd burst into laughter, a cruel kind of laughter, the kind that fills rooms where no one expects to be challenged. But as the sound filled the chamber, the human slowly raised his head, eyes meeting the commander's with a cold, silent stare. And in that single look, everything changed. His eyes were like ice, calm, sharp, and steady. No panic, no fear, just quiet calculation. As if he was looking at a dead man who hadn't realized it yet. The crowd didn't notice it at first, but the laughter began to sound thinner, like even the air inside the chamber felt heavier. The commander stepped closer, his armored boots stopping just inches away, leaning down with his grin wider than ever. He whispered something cruel, but the human didn't react. He just looked straight through him, like the words were nothing but noise, like this commander, this whole council, this entire display of power meant nothing. The alien's smile twitched for a second, just a second, like something inside him recognized danger, but his pride was louder than his instincts. He raised his hands slowly, making sure the cameras caught every angle, every movement, making sure the galaxy saw him humiliate a Deathworlder in chains. The crowd leaned forward, expecting a show, expecting the human to break, to scream, to finally give them the satisfaction they had come for. The sound of the slap cracked through the chamber like a gunshot, his armored palm connecting with the human's face, sharp, loud, echoing through every wall and every broadcast across the stars. The crowd roared with laughter at first, proud of their commander, proud of their power. The alien's grin widened, his eyes shining with the thrill of domination. But something in the air shifted. It was small, silent, invisible, but it was real. The laughter didn't last. It began to fade, like a song losing its rhythm, like a wave breaking against a wall it didn't see coming. The human's head hadn't turned from the slap. He didn't cry out. He didn't even blink. His face stayed exactly where it was. His eyes locked onto the commander like steel, like a predator that had just decided the hunt was over. The alien commander's smile began to tremble without him realizing it. His heart beat faster, and a small shiver climbed the back of his neck. The cameras zoomed in on the human's eyes, calm and cold, not blinking once, like those eyes belonged to something far older and far more dangerous than a man. The crowd that had come for a show now found themselves trapped in silence they couldn't explain. Even the guards felt it, fingers tightening on their triggers without knowing why. The laughter was gone now, replaced by the kind of silence that feels like the edge of a cliff, when everyone knows something is about to happen but no one knows what or when. The alien commander stepped back half a step without meaning to. He forced himself to smile again, forced his pride to cover the rising dread in his chest. But the air didn't care about his pride. The entire chamber felt it. Something had changed. The human straightened his back slowly, the faint sound of his chains pulling tight echoing softly, and every alien in the room held their breath without meaning to. It was the way he moved, slow and steady, not like a prisoner, not like a victim, but like a predator stretching before it strikes. His jaw tightened just slightly, his breathing never speeding up, his heartbeat never quickening. He stood like someone who already knew how the next few minutes would end. And the commander, deep down, began to understand something he didn't want to believe. He wasn't in control anymore. The galaxy had come to see a Deathworlder fall, but what they got was something else. What they got was the calm before something none of them would ever forget. The council leader shifted nervously in his chair. Guards exchanged uneasy glances. Some of the delegates whispered to each other in low voices that trembled just a little. And all across the galaxy, people watching the live feed leaned forward, sensing something they couldn't name. The alien commander forced a laugh, louder than before, desperate to make the crowd laugh again, desperate to regain the moment, but no one followed. The laughter had died with the slap, and only silence remained. It was as if the entire galaxy had held its breath at the same time. And in the center of it all, the Deathworlder didn't speak, didn't move, didn't blink. His silence was louder than anything the commander had said. And it was only the beginning. The silence after the slap did not fade away. It thickened, stretching through the chamber like smoke that no one could breathe through. Every delegate who had laughed moments ago now sat frozen in their seats, their wide eyes glued to the human who had just been struck. The commander still had his hand in the air, as if even his brain hadn't yet processed why the room had turned so heavy. He tried to force a grin again, but it faltered. He expected fear, he expected begging, he expected weakness, but what stared back at him was none of that. What stared back at him was a stillness so cold it made the lights above seem dimmer. The human's jaw tightened, but not out of pain, out of something deeper, something that lived inside people who had survived fire, war, and endless storms on a world that killed the weak before they ever grew old. The commander shifted slightly on his feet without meaning to, and the sound of the movement echoed too loudly in the chamber, too loud for someone who thought he was in control. The human tilted his head just slightly, his eyes narrowing as if measuring the weight of the entire room, and for the first time the commander felt something unfamiliar, something dangerous. He felt small. The guards around the platform gripped their weapons tighter, not because the human had moved, but because he hadn't, because in their bones something told them stillness was worse than anger. One guard took a step back, another swallowed hard. Their training screamed at them to be ready, but their instincts whispered something else entirely. The alien delegates leaned forward in their seats, the laughter completely gone now, the energy of the chamber slowly shifting from arrogance to unease. And across the galaxy, billions who watched the live broadcast fell silent too. Entire worlds stopped their meals. Pilots paused their ships, soldiers in distant trenches turned up their volume. Everyone watching felt it. Though none of them could explain it, they didn't know what had changed, but they knew the air was no longer on the alien commander's side. The alien commander forced himself to laugh, a loud fake bark that bounced off the chamber walls, trying to break the tension he could not understand. His voice cracked at the edges, but he hid it with a sneer, turning toward the crowd like an actor desperate to keep the spotlight. He raised his hands as if to say, "See, he is nothing." But no one laughed with him now. The weight in the air had settled on every chest, and no amount of forced pride could shake it loose. He turned back to the human, expecting him to finally break, but instead the human slowly raised his chin higher, locking eyes with the commander like two predators standing on the same piece of ground, and only one would walk away, The cameras zoomed closer, catching every detail of the human's face, the calm, the cold, the almost terrifying lack of fear. His lips curved into something between a faint smirk and a silent promise, and it made the commander's stomach tighten in a way no war ever had. The commander took a step closer, trying to remind himself and everyone else that he held power here. But the closer he got, the heavier it felt, like stepping toward the center of a storm he didn't understand. His armor suddenly felt too tight, the air too hot, the noise of his own breathing too loud. He leaned forward and hissed insults at the human, calling him beast, savage, filth, trying to bury the growing fear beneath his voice. But the human didn't flinch, didn't blink, didn't even move. His hands inside the glowing cuffs, and that was worse than any threat could ever be, because it wasn't weakness, it was choice. The council leader shifted uneasily in his elevated chair, tapping the metal armrest with one long finger. He could feel something was wrong too. Something in the human's stillness made the hair on the back of his neck rise, and he wasn't even the one standing in front of him. Several delegates whispered to each other in low, hurried tones, their expressions losing the fake confidence they wore like masks. A few of the younger ones glanced toward the exits, their instincts screaming at them to leave, but their pride chained them in place, because to leave now would mean admitting fear of a single human in chains. The broadcast AI began auto-adjusting its focus without being commanded, zooming tighter on the human's face, the system detecting elevated audience reaction across millions of networks. People leaned closer to their screens. Soldiers on distant war fronts clenched their fists without realizing why. Merchants in orbiting stations stopped mid-sentence. Even the children who didn't understand war stared wide-eyed. Something inside them all told them to remember this moment, to not look away. The alien commander noticed it too, the way the world had tilted, and his throat tightened, his smile shaking at the edges, but he refused to step back. Pride louder than fear, ego heavier than instinct. He spat another insult, but it sounded weak in the silence that followed. The human finally moved, not fast, not violent, just slowly raising his head all the way, straightening his spine, and standing taller even in chains. And that single motion sucked the air out of the room like a black hole. Guards stepped back without being ordered. The commander's boots shifted again, and the chamber seemed to shrink around him. It wasn't the movement that scared them, it was the feeling that the one chained in front of them was not the prey here. He was the storm walking in. Silence. A storm waiting for the exact second to break everything. A faint hum filled the room, the kind that comes before thunder. But it wasn't from the chains. It was from the crowd's chest. A shared instinct that said something irreversible was coming. The alien commander forced himself to raise his voice again, shouting about the glory of the council, the strength of their armies, the power they held over Deathworlders. His voice was louder now but less stable, a thin crack sliding beneath his words, trying to convince the crowd, trying to convince himself, but none of it reached the human. None of it mattered. The man in chains was not listening. He was looking, and in his eyes there was no defeat, only a quiet warning. One, the commander was too arrogant to understand. The human exhaled slowly, a single long breath that echoed louder than the commander's shouting, and the room went still again. The guards looked at each other nervously, waiting for orders that wouldn't come, their fingers tightening on triggers they weren't sure they'd dare to use. The delegates sat frozen, their pride turning into discomfort, discomfort into fear. The cameras kept rolling, capturing every second, every twitch, every breath. The galaxy was not watching a trial anymore. The galaxy was watching something else, something it couldn't name, something it would remember. The alien commander clenched his jaw and whispered, "You're just a man." But his voice cracked on the last word, and the human tilted his head slowly to the side, like a predator acknowledging the sound of its prey before striking. The air trembled now, though no one moved. The entire chamber knew what the commander didn't want to admit. The balance had shifted. The chains didn't make the human weak. They made everyone else believe they were safe, and that lie was about to end. The human's eyes burned quietly like the horizon before a storm hits. No lightning yet, no thunder yet, just the unbearable pressure of what everyone could feel but not say. Across the galaxy, those watching leaned even closer, their breaths held, their hearts pounding. The silence stretched long and sharp like a blade, and in that silence one truth settled in every mind present. This was not a prisoner standing in front of them. This was a Deathworlder, and they had just made the biggest mistake of their lives. The alien commander stood in front of the human with forced confidence, his jaw tight, his chest heaving a little faster than before. The laughter in the room was gone, replaced by a silence so thick that it felt like the entire chamber was floating in a vacuum. Somewhere deep inside him a warning whispered to run, but pride chained him harder than steel ever could. He took another step forward, trying to keep control of the show, trying to remind everyone that he was the one with the power here. But the moment he moved, the human's gaze followed him like a hunter tracking prey, calm, unblinking, patient, the kind of stare that doesn't threaten. It promises, and the commander's throat went dry without him understanding why. The guards shifted nervously, their boots scratching against the smooth floor, small sounds that felt louder than explosions in that kind of silence, and everyone watching, from the council balconies to the farthest mining colony tuned into the broadcast, leaned closer to their screens, their hearts picking up the rhythm of something they didn't yet understand, but knew would not end softly. The commander raised his hand again, not to slap this time but to wave at the crowd, forcing a grin that no longer reached his eyes. His voice boomed through the speakers as he shouted about how Deathworlders were nothing but animals. He called the human weak. He called Earth broken. He called humanity extinct before it was even over. His laughter was sharp, desperate, but loud, trying to drown the dread he could feel pressing against his skin like cold metal. The crowd did not respond this time. No laughter followed, their faces tense and pale as the human tilted his head slowly to the side. His lips not smiling, not frowning, just set in the kind of expression that belonged to soldiers who had seen too much war and didn't need words anymore. The commander felt something in his chest sink, but he pretended not to notice. Then it happened, not with a shout, not with chaos, but with silence so clean it carved through the air like a blade. The lights flickered once above the council platform. Every hovering camera stuttered for a heartbeat, just long enough for the galaxy to hold its breath. In that tiny second of darkness, the chains that bound the human made a faint, sharp sound, like something splitting, like a storm waking up. The guards lifted their rifles, but too slow, way too slow, because what moved next wasn't a man escaping. It was something faster, sharper, colder. It was death itself taking a step forward. In 5 seconds, the galaxy saw what happens when arrogance meets a Deathworlder. The first second the chains snapped with a sound like cracking ice, shards of glowing energy scattering across the floor. The second the human's hand shot up like a strike from a predator. Not wild, not messy, but terrifyingly clean. The third second the commander's eyes widened, too late to understand, too slow to react. The fourth second the room filled with the sound of something wet and heavy hitting the polished floor. The fifth second the commander's head rolled across the council's grand platform, golden lights shining off the blood that painted the steps. The entire chamber froze. No one screamed at first because no one could believe what they were seeing. The alien commander's body stood for a heartbeat longer before collapsing to the ground with a dull, final thud. The human stood where he had been, unchained now, his breathing still calm, his eyes as steady as before, not a drop of panic on his face, just the quiet certainty of someone who had already decided the outcome long before this moment. The cameras captured everything, broadcasting every inch of that movement to billions of screens across thousands of star systems. Children gasped, soldiers grinned, rulers clenched their fists, and for the first time in generations, the galaxy remembered why the word Deathworlder was never said lightly. The guards closest to him stumbled backward, some raising their rifles, but their hands shook so badly they couldn't aim. The rest of the delegates leaned back in their seats, their mouths open, their breathing stuck in their throats. The council leader's hands trembled against the armrest of his throne-like chair. One of the alien ambassadors screamed, but the sound was drowned out by the quiet hum of the blood pooling at the commander's feet. The room was heavy with something old and primal. Fear, the kind that no empire could control, no council could silence. Across the galaxy, screens replayed the footage again and again, slow motion, frame by frame, analysis after analysis, but no one could miss the truth of it. The commander had been alive, proud, laughing, and then he wasn't. 5 seconds separated a king from a corpse, and that 5 seconds now lived inside the heads of every leader, every soldier, every citizen watching. The galaxy had seen battles, it had seen wars, but it had never seen anything like this. Not in the center of the council, not under their own flag. The human didn't gloat, He didn't raise his hands, he didn't roar like a beast. He just stood over the fallen commander's body, quiet, steady, blood dripping down his knuckles like a warning written in red. His eyes swept the room slowly, not fast, not frantic, just moving from face to face like he was memorizing every one of them. And everyone who met his gaze felt something deep in their chest go cold. This was not chaos. This was precision. This was a Deathworlder sending a message without ever opening his mouth. A reminder that some chains were never strong enough to hold what Earth had built in its storms. The Council soldiers finally began to move, but they moved like men who already knew they were too late. They surrounded him, but not one dared to fire. Their fingers hovered over triggers, their bodies shaking like prey trapped too close to something that didn't fear them. The human slowly lowered his blood-stained hand to his side. The light above flickered again, like even the power inside the chamber bowed beneath the weight of what had just happened. Somewhere in the upper rows of the chamber, an ambassador whispered to another in a trembling voice, "Deathworlders." And the words spread like fire through every system. Whispered, feared, remembered. The galaxy had just watched its arrogance die on a council floor. And standing in the middle of it all was a single human, breathing slowly, calm as ever. The storm that had warned them without ever needing to speak. The moment the commander's head hit the floor, the chamber stopped breathing. Every sound died in the throat of 1,000 witnesses. The world outside felt like it paused. Like even the stars were holding their light still. The silence didn't just sit in the room. It crawled into the skin of everyone present. The guards froze where they stood, rifles shaking in their hands. The alien delegates stared wide-eyed at the headless body lying in a pool of blood. The council leader's jaw trembled behind his golden mask. The floating cameras kept recording everything, transmitting the image of a dead commander and an unshaken Deathworlder to billions of homes across the galaxy. No editing, no censorship, no delay. Just pure, raw fear broadcast in real time. The human stood in the center of it all like the eye of a storm, calm, silent. His breathing steady, the blood on his hand glistening under the council's white lights, and his shadow stretching longer than anyone else's in the room. The delegates in the front rows pushed themselves back instinctively, their chairs scraping the floor in loud screeches that echoed through the chamber. Their polished robes now meaningless against the raw terror running down their spines. The guards circled him, but none dared to step closer. They had trained for battle, for insurgents, for rebels, but not for this, not for a man who had broken chains in silence and killed a commander in 5 seconds flat. Their fingers hovered on their triggers, but they all knew pulling them would not make them safer. It would make them targets. The council leader tried to speak, but the words caught in his throat. His fingers digging into the armrest, his breath shallow, as he looked at the humans standing upright, unchained, blood dripping down his knuckles like a warning carved into the floor itself. Across the galaxy, the image froze hearts. People on distant colonies leaned closer to their screens. Soldiers in trenches went silent. Ambassadors in their own council halls stared at the broadcast. Entire military networks buzzed like hornets, all watching the same 5-second clip play again and again. They had mocked Earth for being wild. They had laughed at Deathworlders for being reckless. They had believed chains and threats could keep them small. But now those same people watched in fear as one unarmed human turned a council chamber into a graveyard. The sound of the commander's head rolling across the floor would haunt them for generations. The chamber doors creaked open at the far end as reinforcement units rushed in, their boots striking the floor in synchronized steps. But even they slowed down when they saw what waited inside. Their leader, the alien commander, was headless, the delegates were pale, and the human, the man they had called a beast, was standing tall like nothing had touched him. They raised their weapons, but their movements were hesitant, not because they lacked orders, but because something inside them screamed. Not to provoke him, not to take a step too close. Every soldier there had seen combat, but none of them had ever felt this kind of silence before. It wasn't quiet like peace. It was quiet like the moment before everything ends. The human tilted his head slowly, his eyes moving across the line of soldiers and delegates like he was weighing them. Not panicking, not shouting, not running, just looking, and every alien who met his gaze felt something cold crawl down their spine. Like those eyes weren't just seeing them, they were judging them. The guards' hands trembled as their rifles dipped slightly lower without an order being given. The council leader slammed a trembling hand on the table, shouting at them to restrain. The human, but even his own voice cracked halfway through. The order hung in the air like smoke, but no one stepped forward. Reporters from a dozen star systems shouted into their broadcast feeds, their voices cracking with the weight of what they were witnessing. Some screamed that war had just begun. Others whispered about ancient human wars, about the legends of why Deathworlders were never enslaved, never touched. The footage spread faster than light. By the time the blood from the commander's body reached the edge of the platform, every major system in the galaxy already knew what had happened. The human took one step forward, slow, controlled, and every single alien in the chamber flinched, their instincts overriding their training. The sound of his boot touching the floor echoed louder than any explosion, louder than the council leader's voice, louder than the sirens that began to ring through the halls, alarms blaring to warn of an internal breach. But this wasn't a breach. This was something far more dangerous. This was a warning. The delegates in the balconies began whispering nervously, their voices turning into panic. Words like war, Deathworld, uncontrolled, and retribution slipped through their lips, their polished diplomacy shattered like glass. The guards closest to him slowly stepped back without looking at one another. Their fear unspoken but shared. The human didn't smile. He didn't shout a threat. He didn't need to. His existence in that moment was the threat. The council leader slammed his hand again, screaming for someone to take him down. But not a single guard moved. They all saw what had happened to their commander. They knew rushing him would end the same way. The human finally spoke, his voice low and calm, almost too soft for the microphones but somehow heard by everyone. "You should have known better." Those words hit harder than any weapon, and for the first time in the long history of that chamber, no alien spoke back. The alarms wailed louder now, but their sound only made the silence inside the room feel heavier. Ships outside the council station began moving into formation. Fleets scrambled for orders, but even across the stars, military leaders hesitated, because they all knew the truth. What had just happened wasn't just a killing. It was a statement, one that would echo far beyond this room. The human stood there, a single figure surrounded by trembling soldiers and pale leaders, and without lifting a finger, he made the most powerful people in the galaxy afraid. The commander's blood kept spreading across the floor like a dark stain no one could clean. The council's authority cracked in that silence, and the galaxy finally understood what it meant to call someone a Deathworlder. The alarms outside the chamber screamed through the station's steel halls. Red lights flashed across the ceilings. Soldiers rushed into position. Fleets repositioned in orbit. But inside the council chamber there was a stillness no alarm could break. The body of the alien commander lay lifeless in its own blood, the severed head resting on the cold floor, its eyes still wide in shock as if death itself had refused to grant him the dignity of closing them. The human stood over that body not like a fugitive but like a soldier who had already chosen his battlefield. His posture straight, his breathing calm, the blood on his hand drying slowly, turning dark as the cameras kept rolling, broadcasting his every move to billions of screens across the stars. No one watching could look away. No one dared to blink, because what they had seen in those 5 seconds was something the galaxy had spent centuries trying to forget. The council leader, voice shaking, slammed a trembling hand on the command pad, activating an emergency lockdown. Massive steel doors slid shut with a deep, echoing thud, trapping everyone inside with the human. The guards in black armor rushed to form a circle around him, their rifles up, their boots stiff, their movements trained and sharp, but their eyes told the truth. They were terrified. No training in the galaxy prepared them for this. No manual taught them what to do when a Deathworlder killed a commander like swatting a fly. Their grips on the triggers were tight, but no one fired. The human tilted his head just slightly and their fingers froze like stone. They had faced wars, insurgents, rebels, but this was different. This was the kind of danger you didn't provoke because it didn't bark, it bit without warning. The council leader screamed for someone to restrain him, but his voice cracked in the middle of the order, the words breaking under the pressure of fear that filled the room. The delegates pressed themselves against their chairs, some clutching the edges, some whispering frantic prayers to gods no one had spoken to in decades. The fear wasn't just in their eyes. It was in the air, in the way their breaths shook, in the way the silence sat on their shoulders heavier than the walls themselves. The human turned slowly toward the council leader, his eyes cold, sharp, and merciless. The kind of look that didn't need threats, didn't need speeches. It simply promised consequences. And then the truth began to leak. A voice on the broadcast channel cracked through the silence. A reporter speaking without realizing the entire galaxy could hear. Whispering words no one in power wanted to be said out loud. The human wasn't a random prisoner, he wasn't a rogue soldier. He was part of a unit the Council thought was extinct, a black flag unit. The kind Earth created when survival was no longer a choice but a promise. Soldiers who didn't just fight wars, they ended them. More reports came in, leaking faster than the Council could stop them. Files surfacing on hidden networks, transmissions bouncing across the stars, and one truth echoed through every feed. This man had let them capture him. He had walked into their chains on purpose. He had stood in their chamber not as prey but as a warning wearing human skin. The Council leader's face paled under his gold mask, the realization striking him like a blade. The guards shifted uneasily as their earpieces buzzed with new orders that contradicted each other. Some saying, "Contain him," others whispering, "Don't touch him." Panic was crawling through their ranks like a living thing. The delegates could feel it too. Their whispers turned into arguments, their arguments turned into quiet sobs as the image of the commander's head kept replaying in their minds. 5 seconds, that was all it took for their illusion of control to collapse like dust. The human finally spoke again, his voice low, calm, and steady. The kind of voice that carried through the room without needing to be loud. "You thought the chains were yours," he said. And the way he said it made every guard stiffen. Every delegate looked down. "They were mine." A shiver rippled through the room. Not because of the words themselves, but because of how easily he spoke them. Like he was not making a threat, but stating a fact. The Council leader slammed his fist again, screaming for the feed to be cut. But it was already too late. The broadcast had spread across too many networks. Too many eyes were already watching. Military ships across dozens of star systems began to move without orders, their commanders whispering to each other, some remembering old wars with humans, others too young to understand why their superiors trembled at the word Deathworlder. Small colonies cheered in silence. Criminal syndicates paused their operations. Entire fleets put themselves on alert. The galaxy could feel it. Something old was waking, and it had humanity's face. Inside the chamber, a single guard finally tried to step forward, his armor creaking under the weight of his fear, his voice trembling as he shouted for the human to surrender. But the human didn't even turn to look at him, just raised his eyes slowly, and the guard's knees nearly gave out. He stopped mid-step without anyone stopping him, his rifle shaking, his breath sharp and uneven. It wasn't a power, it wasn't magic, it was the look of someone who had killed more soldiers than the guard could imagine and would not hesitate to do it again. One of the alien ambassadors finally broke down, shouting at the Council leader that this wasn't supposed to happen, that Deathworlders were supposed to be contained, controlled, broken. But the words sounded weak even to their own ears. Their empire had believed in the myth of human weakness for too long, and now the truth stood in front of them, drenched in blood and silence. The human moved one step forward, slow and deliberate, and like a wave, every soldier stepped back at the same time, their discipline falling apart under the weight of instinct. Across the galaxy, the name of the commander who had mocked humanity was already trending through 1,000 networks. Not as a hero, but as a warning, his image forever tied to the last mistake he ever made. In quiet corners of space, old admirals and warlords whispered to each other the same line. The Deathworlders are still watching. And inside the chamber, the Council leaders realized too late that this wasn't just the death of one man. It was the death of the illusion that humanity had ever been under their control. Outside the Council chamber, fleets drifted in tense silence, warships armed and ready, command centers flooded with confused orders. The galaxy was listening to a broadcast that was never meant to be heard, watching an execution that was never meant to happen. In 1,000 star systems, commanders stared at the same screen, watching the humans standing calm and unchained, watching the severed head of their most feared alien commander lying like a fallen idol on the Council floor. Nothing could undo those 5 seconds. No law, no decree. No fleet could erase the fear that had rooted itself deep inside the bones of every alien leader watching. The Council's control was already slipping through their fingers like sand. Inside the chamber, the air was so heavy that every breath seemed to echo. The guards stood in a circle, but their formation had no meaning anymore. Their rifles were pointed, but their hands shook, their eyes wide. The human stood alone in the center, his calm breathing louder than the sirens, louder than the alarms. louder than the trembling voice of the council leader who was desperately whispering into his comm asking for help that would not come. The council leader's voice cracked as he tried to speak through the chamber speakers, demanding the human surrender. But even his own soldiers didn't believe the words coming out of his mouth. He ordered the transmission to be cut, but the network refused to obey, hacked, overridden, or perhaps deliberately left open, no one knew. The broadcast carried the image of a single human facing an empire built on fear and arrogance, and it was doing more damage than 1,000 warships could entire. Fleets began whispering orders, commanders refusing to move. No one wanted to be the first to face a Deathworlder after this. No one wanted to be remembered as the second fool after the dead commander. The human tilted his head slightly upward as if he could hear the static-filled voices echoing through the walls. But his gaze stayed locked on the council leader, steady and cold. No rage, no shouting, just a quiet look that burned hotter than any threat. The guards around him shifted their feet like prey in a lion's den. The delegates on the upper balconies whispered frantically. Their voices cracking with fear, they spoke of retaliation, of extermination, of war. But even they didn't believe. The lies their mouths were making, they knew what the galaxy knew: wars against Deathworlders never ended well for anyone else. Then the lights in the chamber flickered again. The entire hall went dark for a breath, and when the light returned, the enormous council wall behind the delegates lit up with an unexpected image. A black transmission, simple, silent, carrying the emblem of Earth. A circle of silver stars around a single burning world. The entire room went still. The soldiers who had been whispering fell silent. The delegates held their breath, and even the alarms seemed to fade behind the weight of that symbol. A voice followed, calm, low, steady, neither angry nor kind. "This is Earth Command," it said. "The galaxy is listening." Every screen across every star system tuned into the council broadcast flickered and locked onto the same image, the same voice. There was no way to stop it, no firewall strong enough, no encryption deep enough. Humanity had planned this, the capture, the chains, the humiliation. Everything had been bait. The moment the commander had slapped the human, the galaxy had walked straight into a trap it didn't even know existed. The voice continued, each word spoken like steel. "We asked for respect," it said. "You answered with chains. We gave you silence, and you mistook it for weakness. Today, you have learned why Deathworlders are not to be touched." The delegates began shouting over one another, their fear bursting through their polished language. Some screamed for negotiations, others for war, but none of it mattered, because the galaxy wasn't listening to them, it was listening to Earth. A fleet commander on a distant moon whispered into a dead comm channel, "God help us." Another on a distant ship said nothing at all. He simply began pulling back his fleet from orbit. One by one, the military forces that had once surrounded Earth tightened their grip on their own territory instead. The balance of fear had shifted in a single broadcast. The council leader stood slowly, his hands shaking, trying to act like he still held power, but his voice betrayed him. He shouted for the human to stand down, shouted that humanity was violating council law, shouted that the entire galaxy would respond with force, but before he could finish, the voice on the broadcast cut him like a knife. "We are not asking for permission," the Earth Command voice said. "We are reminding you of what you chose to forget." And then it happened. One by one, images of warships began appearing behind the Earth emblem, silent, black, and vast. They filled the screen until there was no space left, thousands of ships, some small and fast, others so massive they cast shadows on the stars. The delegates gasped, their faces turning pale, their lips parting without words. The soldiers lowered their weapons unconsciously. The entire chamber seemed to shrink beneath the weight of those ships. The fleet that the galaxy believed was broken, hidden, or weak was staring right back at them. The human standing in the center of the chamber didn't have to say anything. The fleet spoke for him. The Earth Command voice didn't raise its tone. It didn't roar. It simply spoke one last line that wrapped around every throat in the galaxy like cold iron. "Never lay hands on a Deathworlder again." And then the transmission ended with a soft hum, leaving silence behind. The soldiers in the chamber didn't move. The delegates couldn't breathe. The council leader sat down slowly, realizing the balance of power had shifted in a way no fleet, no law, no speech could undo. Earth hadn't declared war. It had issued a warning, and the galaxy heard it loud and clear. The human looked around the chamber one last time, his eyes sweeping over every terrified face. And for the first time, no one looked back at him. They didn't see a man anymore. They saw a storm, a war, a consequence. They saw Earth. And in that moment, the galaxy understood something it had forgotten for too long. Deathworlders didn't bark. They waited in silence. And when they finally spoke, the stars themselves went quiet. The chamber stayed frozen long after the transmission ended. No one dared to speak. No one dared to breathe too loudly. The great council hall, once a monument of power where entire species bowed their heads, now felt like a cage, and the predator inside was no longer in chains. The human stood there, calm and silent, his eyes sharp like a blade that had already cut through the Empire's pride. The alien delegates who had traveled across the stars to mock a Deathworlder were now clutching the edges of their seats like children lost in a storm. The guards who had once marched proudly stood stiff, sweat dripping beneath their armor, fingers shaking against the cold triggers of weapons they knew were useless, and the council leader who had ruled through fear sat slumped in his chair, his golden mask gleaming under the blood-stained lights like a relic of a power that no longer existed. Outside the chamber, the galaxy trembled. Fleets that had once surrounded Earth's borders as a show of strength now stayed silent, their admirals staring at the impossible wall of warships that had appeared behind the Earth command transmission. Black-hulled leviathans that had never been seen, never been counted, never been tracked, ships that weren't supposed to exist. Some commanders tried to rally their fleets, but their voices cracked before they could finish the order. They were not preparing for war. They were trying to survive something far larger than their courage. Entire sectors paused movement, trade routes froze, rebel forces went silent. Every faction from the richest empire to the smallest smuggler colony was watching the same moment replaying over and over again. An alien commander slapping a Deathworlder, 5 seconds of silence, then his head rolling on the floor, followed by the voice of Earth shaking the stars. Inside the council chamber, the human lowered his blood-stained hands slowly, the dried crimson glinting under the flickering lights. He took one step forward and like a ripple through water every alien around him stepped back. Instinct swallowing pride whole. It wasn't a command, it wasn't intimidation. It was the simple fact that no one wanted to stand in the way of someone who had just changed history without raising his voice. The council leader tried to speak again, his mouth opening and closing like a fish pulled from water. But the words refused to come out. They weren't strong enough to exist in the same space as the silence the human had created. One of the ambassadors, trembling and pale, finally broke down, whispering, "We can't fight this." His voice cracked like glass. Another delegate slammed his fist on the table screaming about retaliation, about fleets, about how they would never bow to humans again. But his voice shook too, his shouting hollow against the weight pressing down on every living soul in that room. He shouted not because he believed his words, but because fear was eating him alive. The human turned his eyes toward him, just a simple glance, and the delegate fell silent mid-sentence, his throat closing as if the air had turned to ice. Across the galaxy, the Council's allies began sending encrypted messages, their leadership in panic, their populations in shock. Some began whispering about treaties, others about retreat, a few extremists about revenge, but none of them moved their fleets. Not a single ship crossed the invisible line around Earth's territory anymore, because everyone who saw that fleet understood the truth. They weren't looking at a superpower, they were looking at something older, something patient, something that didn't need to prove its strength. Earth had been quiet for too long, but quiet doesn't mean weak. Quiet means waiting. The council leader finally managed to speak, his voice small and broken. "What do you want?" It wasn't the voice of an emperor. It was the voice of a man who had realized his throne was built on sand. The human didn't smile. He didn't make demands. He didn't need to. He simply looked at him with the same cold silence that had shattered their pride. And the weight of that silence was heavier than 1,000 war declarations. Behind those calm eyes, they could all see it. Humanity didn't need this war. Humanity didn't want this war. But if pushed, it would end it before it began. The council guards lowered their rifles slowly, almost unconsciously, their bodies giving up before their minds did. They understood what their leaders didn't, that the thing standing in front of them wasn't just a soldier. It was the embodiment of a warning every race had once whispered in the dark, a warning they had grown arrogant enough to forget. The ambassadors turned their faces away, ashamed, terrified, some unable to meet his eyes, others already imagining the headlines that would follow them home. They had come to watch humanity kneel, And instead, the galaxy had knelt to humanity's silence. Outside, the fleet belonging to Earth didn't fire a single shot. It didn't need to. The sheer size of it had already done what war could not. Planets that had insulted Earth for years began erasing records. Leaders who had mocked them started sending quiet, desperate messages for talks and treaties. Old enemies of Earth suddenly remembered how to be polite. The fear spread through the stars faster than any bullet, faster than any ship, faster than any speech. The human finally walked toward the massive chamber doors, his boots echoing through the hall like slow thunder, and the sea of soldiers parted without a single word. No one dared to stop him, not because they were ordered to let him go, but because deep inside, something ancient told them trying to stop him would not end well. As he walked past the commander's body, the blood pooled wider, soaking the council floor, and no one stepped forward to clean it. That blood wasn't just his. It was their arrogance, their pride, their illusion of power bleeding out for the galaxy to see. When he reached the doorway, he paused and looked back one last time, his eyes sweeping across the terrified faces of the most powerful beings in the galaxy. And in that single glance he gave them something worse than war. He gave them memory, the kind that stays long after fleets are built and empires fall. Then without a word he walked through the doors, and the entire council exhaled like people who had survived something they didn't fully understand. Because they hadn't just seen a man walk out, they had seen the storm leave, and storms always leave behind a sky that never looks the same. And far beyond the council chamber, in the deepest corners of space, the galaxy whispered one truth again. The truth they thought they had buried under centuries of arrogance. The truth that now burned brighter than ever. Never touch a Deathworlder.